How should we feel about death? Or to put it more personally, how should I feel about my own death? How should you feel about yours? There is no should in that question, I know that, but nonetheless, it's something that started to haunt me a bit in my 40s, as it does. And I decided it was time to start thinking about how I wanted to grapple with the inevitability of my own mortality. So I turned to the writings of medieval religious women, the visionary and mystical treatises that they produced. Might seem like an odd starting point, but in fact, it's a great place to begin to explore that question because these women who were Christian thought a lot about death and dying and about what it meant and how they lived in relation to it. Moreover, the stories told about them, their biographies, also really focus on their deaths. The stereotypical medieval holy person, the Christian saint, or better yet, the martyr, lived life fully embracing the possibility of death and is said to have rushed eagerly into the arms of the beloved bridegroom Jesus, leaving behind all the sufferings of the world. Women in particular were associated with this idea because they in the Middle Ages were strongly associated with the body. And so they were connected to bodily forms of devotion, like ascetic practices. And so these practices, things like extreme suffering, severe illnesses, and then a joyful death, were kind of the stock in trade of the medieval female saint. So thinking about that and my own questions, I started to wonder, how did these women actually feel about death? Are these just the stories told about them, or did they also feel a strong compulsion towards death, a strong desire for it? Or did they feel fear or anxiety or a combination of these? So these are the questions that I explore in my most recent book, Medieval Holy Women and the Desire for Death. There have been a lot of studies of death in the Middle Ages, but they tend to focus on the externalities, things like testaments and wills, gravestones, burial rites, people who come back from the dead. What I was interested in was death from the inside and what I called our affective relationship to death, which simply means how we feel about death and dying. Um, Now, of course, we don't have narratives that actually show us how people felt at the moment of their death. That would be cool, but it'd be really hard to produce one of those narratives. So instead, what I looked at were mystical treatises, visionary writings, spiritual guides written by women that talked about how they thought about feeling about death and how they taught others to feel about death as a way of trying to get closer to that actual feeling. Women in this period were excluded from university education, and even educated women had limited access to the theological discourses coming out of the newly formed universities. And so their writings tend to be more experiential, sometimes autobiographical, like accounts of visions, accounts of revelations or experiences they've had, and sometimes more programmatic, like spiritual guides, paths for others to follow that were written for people in their community, usually also women, although not exclusively so. So what I found in looking at these texts was that women do express a desire for death, but they do it in a really different way from how the men who write about and for them express it. So in the male clerically authored texts, what we often see is a desire as kind of a unidirectional or acquisitive desire, like you want to get something to satisfy a desire. You want to die because the world is terrible. Sort of like how if I'm hungry, I desire a sandwich, and then I'm not hungry anymore, and I can move on. So it's a desire that's satisfied. In the women's writings, we see a much more complex and nuanced account of that kind of desire, where the desire itself becomes a kind of transformation, a way of transforming oneself. And what that means is that when they talk about desiring death, they're also talking in a way about desiring life, because life is where that desire is produced, life is where it's generated, and where one can be kind of formed into the ideal subject, loving God and desiring to be with God. I can give you a very small example of the difference. In the 12th century, a monk named Aelred of Rievaulx wrote a treatise for female recluses, so women who had formally died to the world and were living a life devoted to prayer. And he said that even though everyone, even wild animals, is afraid of death, if you have a clear conscience and you recognize the sorrows and sufferings of the world, then you too won't fear death, and you can desire it as a way of freeing yourself, of being free from this burden. So that's that kind of like, I want to die so that I don't have this anymore. In contrast, in Beatrice of Nazareth, a 13th century nun, in her own writings, we see her outline a progress, a spiritual progress that involves a desire for death that's really different. So here, the soul desires death, but she says explicitly, not because of the sorrows and sufferings of this world, not for fear of anything that will happen here, but rather only for pure and holy love. She also dwells at great length on the importance of dwelling in that state of desire. It's uncomfortable. The soul wants to get out of it, but it's really vital to the soul's progress that they inhabit the state of yearning, of longing, of producing that desire. And in so doing that, they're transformed and their lives are transformed as well. So from this, I think we can see a couple of things. First, that women were writing complex theology that is very distinct from the clerically authored, more traditional theology coming out of the universities. That's not a new insight, but I do look at it through a different lens by focusing on death and dying. Second, that what women wrote for and about women is quite different from what men wrote for and about women at this time. And third, what I think resonated for me personally, and where I think even though I imagine that very few of us share the worldview of a 13th through 15th century European nun, there still is something that we can share here, which is the idea that living life in view of death can have a transformative effect on death itself, that life can become a space of really drawing out what is best in ourselves so that hopefully, with luck, death when it comes is a welcome conclusion rather than a terrible interruption. I'm Jessica Barr. I'm a professor of comparative literature in the College of Humanities and Fine Arts at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and that's my big idea.
Awesome. Awesome.